I'm very fascinated by the history of camera companies, particularly Japanese camera companies. Anyways, today I want to talk about one of my favorites, that is Topcon or Topcor. Not a name many people are familiar with. That's because this company did not survive, as we can say. Actually, it still exists, but now it's manufacturing other equipment like GPS and lasers and medical stuff. But anyways, today we're going to talk about Topcon or Topcor. Now, this company actually started in 1932. It was kind of made for the Japanese Imperial Army. Like they used to be part of Seiko Show. If you don't know them, Seiko is like they make watches now, but like back then they used to be like a spin-off of that company. And back in the day, if you were a camera company, you probably worked for the Japanese Imperial Army. So Japan had all these camera companies manufacturing surveying equipment, binoculars, and all that stuff. Actually, something pretty interesting is that if it wasn't for World War II, we probably wouldn't have so many advancements in optics and like photography, because during World War II, the Japanese army actually needed this technology. And there's some interesting stories out there. For example, Nikon, like, okay, the Americans tried very much to attack the Japanese, and they would do these attacks like at night or during the day or early mornings. And for some reason, the Japanese could see the Americans coming from so far away. Even though Japan didn't have radar, and the Americans did, the Americans were stumped as to how in the world the Japanese, who didn't even have radar, could see these attacks coming. And that's because actually Nikon used to manufacture periscopes for the submarines, those long sticks that pop out of the water and you could like see underwater. But the problem with it was that usually they would lose so much light. So the Japanese Imperial Army pressured Nikon into manufacturing like better quality periscopes that were brighter, so they could use them in the evenings and at dawn and at night. So once the Americans finally beat Japan, they got a hold of this technology. They were like so amazed by Japanese optics. But yeah, as I was saying, World War II was a pretty eventful time for photography. Actually, there's so many stories related to World War II. I wish I could tell you them all. Like, did you know that the Americans pretty much killed almost every, not every, but almost every worker in the Pentax like factories and business, because we used to do these Tokyo bombings, and one of those bombs actually fell on like the Pentax main office or main factory and killed almost all the workers. So some pretty amazing stories out there related to like World War II and Japanese camera companies. But anyways, after World War II, actually most of these camera companies had to like shut down, and they could only operate if they had permission from the Japanese government. So all these companies went from making like equipment, like military grade equipment for the government, to making consumer electronics or consumer optics, because that was the only thing they were allowed to do, but you have to get permission from the Japanese government to do so. And something really interesting also happened after World War II. The Allied countries actually released all the patents related to like German designs in all kinds of things. But in this case, we're only interested like in optics and manufacturing. So the Allied forces made all these patents available to the whole world, and like the Russians actually took many of the equipment from like the Zeiss factories and some of the Zeiss glass. More stories on that later in a separate video. Something very interesting happened, because once these patents were released, pretty much all these countries started making Leica copies, you know what I mean? And I actually wrote these down because I knew this was a thing, but I didn't really realize the extent of it. Like, for example, there were over 500 different Leica copies at the time. Canon made their own, but at the time Canon was actually named Quanon. Like, I bet you didn't know that. The Minolta 35, we all know about the Russian lenses. They made the Zorky, Nika or Nikon, the Leotax, more on that later. The Yashica YE, the Periflex, if for those of you who are interested in like British optics, but British optics, meh, no one really cares about those. Sorry for those British optics enthusiasts. There's actually two lenses that I want to get from Leica thread mounts, and they're both by different companies. One of them, of course, is by Tokyo Kogaku, the Topcon S 5cm f2. And if you're watching my optics videos, you know that 5cm f2 just means 50mm f2. It's actually like supposed to be like a sonar copy. So I really want to get that lens. I just don't have the money. Another one I've really wanted to get my hands on is the Tanar. They're very like, these are names that probably, if you're familiar with like Leica glass, you probably heard these names. They're extremely expensive lenses, not because they're like amazing, they're just collectibles, but I really want to get my hands on one of these lenses, either the Tanar 5cm f2 or the Topcon S 50mm f2. And they're both sonar copies, These are like Leica copies, like back in the day when the camera companies started making their cameras, they all just kind of copied German design, because that was the thing. And after some time, I think Japan actually superseded German optics at some point, and they kind of just realized like, hey, we can actually make these cameras much better. Because if you're not familiar with like German design, like Germans like to over design their cameras. Like they complicated stuff like where you didn't have to. And I'm sorry there's any like German viewers and you think I'm stereotyping or anything, but like when it comes to like German optics, they like really over design stuff. I think the Japanese like were the most practical ones. They found ways to make things more efficient. And when it comes to Russian lenses, they just kind of cut corners wherever they could, and somehow it still worked. So yeah, anyways, I'm really keen on getting the Topcon S 55cm f2. It's supposed to be like very close to a Leica lens, and these are like Leica copies by different Japanese companies. Now fast forward to 1950s, and this is actually where Topcon first started to use the name Topco. If you haven't caught on, so Topcon is actually a kind of a shortened version of Tokyo Optical Company. Some of you are familiar with Nikon. Well, of course, all of you are familiar with Nikon, but the Japanese word for Japan is actually Nippon. So if you take Nippon Optical Company, you get like Nikon. And if you get Tokyo Optical Company, you get Topcon. And there's actually a little interesting piece of trivia here, because when Nikon wanted to like sell their products in Germany, it sounded very much like the word Zeiss, icon or icon. I don't know how to say it exactly. So they couldn't really sell under the name Nikon in Germany. So they had to change the name to like Nikkor for selling their products in Germany like later on. This is just like a little piece of trivia I heard somewhere. I don't know exactly, but it sounds about right. So anyways, I thought that would be very interesting for you guys. And if I'm wrong, one of you can let me know. I'm sure some of you will let me know, but I just thought that was really interesting. Anyways, now the year is 1957. This is actually a very big year for Topcon because they released like the first ever SLR, and it was actually like really, really successful. And it was followed by the Pentax Spotmatic. Some of you know I like Asahi Pentax, so they released a Spotmatic right after that. Here is where things start to get kind of, either you could say it was a great time for Topcon, or it's kind of like the beginning of their downfall. Because Topcon, if you ask me, had some of like the best glass from Japanese companies. Like technology-wise, they were light years ahead of Nikon, Pentax, Canon, all the other camera companies. Because to me, Topcon is like military grade, state-of-the-art optics. When I think of Nikon and Canon and all stuff like that, even though I love Pentax very much, they were kind of more consumer oriented in my opinion. Even though like Nikon and Canon and Pentax kind of did appeal to the pros. Well, kind of didn't get this shit together until much later, but like they were more successful at marketing themselves, and like if you look at these Topcon cameras, even though they were amazing, they were not what you would say very sexy. Like they were big and they were bulky. They didn't really appeal to like the average person, even though their glass was just like top-notch stuff. Like their glass is just amazing. I really love Topcon lenses, and I'm gonna make a video about one that I have later. I really love this lens. But yeah, in the 60s, Topcon became an affiliate with Tokyo Shibuya. If you're not familiar with them, they're what you know as Toshiba right now. So here we see them stepping more into like the realm of electronics, which is actually where they are now. Like they're really the world leaders in tracking GPS and like medical optical equipment. And come 1963, they released the RE Super, Topcon RE Super. That's actually that was the first camera to have through the lens light metering. Like before, you had to have either metering with an external light reader or light meter, or you would have like a separate part on the camera. But this was like the first time that a camera had metering that came in through the lens. So that was kind of like a big thing. And when it comes to innovation, like I said, Topcon was ahead of Nikon, Pentax, Canon, and all the other companies, really in terms of innovation and quality. But they were just not very good at marketing themselves. And it's also a good time to point out one flaw in their design, because, okay, Topcon back then used something called the Exacta mount. And there's very different kinds of mounts back in the day. And one of the major flaws of the Exacta mount is that the neck was actually very, very small, very narrow, So what this caused was like you could not use very wide rear elements. So it kind of limited their designs of the lenses. Even though they were like top quality lenses, you couldn't really come up with, you couldn't make a variety of lenses. You could only use the classic focal lengths like 28, 35, 50, 55, 58, 85, 105, 135. Those are like the main focal lengths. Like you couldn't really deviate from them. And at the time, they're like all these companies were coming up with lenses left and right. And Topcon, even though they had like in my opinion, like the best quality of Japanese lenses, probably superseding Leica or Zeiss. Maybe I'm overdoing it at that point, but they were definitely up there. They just didn't have the variety of lenses as the other competitors, because they were using the Exacta mount, which was very, very thin and bottleneck. Might I point out, this is also the reason why I don't like Sony cameras, because Sony also uses a very small bottleneck type mount, and that actually limits the designs of their lenses. That's why there's not that much Sony glass out there. And also that's why their lenses are huge. Even though Sony's are supposed to be like mirrorless cameras, their lenses are just like massive. So they're gonna have to change that or do something about it, because that was one of the mistakes that Topcon did with their lens design. Even though they had really beautiful glass, it was very limiting to them. Speaking of lenses, now would be a very good time to differentiate between some kind of glass out there, because there's really two kinds of lenses. I mean, there's more, if you consider the OTM lenses, which are more like collector items at this point, but they're really, really awesome. I really want one. But anyways, there's the RE Topcor lenses, which use the Exacta mount. If you want a Topcor lens, you should get like a Topcor RE, because those are like the top of the line military grade optics. that you want for your camera, you know. But there's also the UV line, which is more like more consumer oriented. Now, actually, the UV lenses are pretty good. You know, people always say they're just not as good as the REs. They're good lenses, and you can actually find them for like $10, $20, $30. The only problem is that I can't find a way to mount those lenses. Like, I know somebody makes Topcon UV mounts to whatever camera you're using. The only problem is that they're so rare and hard to get that it's just not worth your time trying to mount a Topcon UV lens. So heed my warning, don't get Topcon UV lenses unless you have like a Topcon gun that you can camera that you can put it on. Instead, get the REs, because you can just get an exact amount for those lenses, and you're much more likely to find an exact amount than a UV mount, you know. Make your life easier for yourself. Anyways, like, many of you are not familiar with Topcon lenses, especially if you're younger, but like if you're from like the older generation, especially the one that fought like in Vietnam War, you might have held a Topcon camera or known somebody who did. In 65, the US Navy was actually holding like a contest to see like which is going to be the next camera they're going to use in battle or whatever. And I believe it was the Topcon Super D that actually won the competition. If you've seen these cameras, they're like really massive, really, I know, okay. If you look at old vintage cameras, especially like SLRs, you think they're like kind of bulletproof. Like, if you drop these SLR cameras to the floor, they would probably break the floor before the camera breaks. If you saw a Super D Topcon camera, these things were huge. Like, I believe that if you dropped like a mortar shell on one of these cameras, the camera would survive. So that was a choice camera for the military. And I think many people, especially veterans that fought in the wars, they are probably familiar with this camera because it was used a lot because they were so durable, and as I said, they're just built to last. You know, these are really awesome cameras. They're kind of expensive these days, but yeah, I thought that was interesting trivia to throw out there. And the Super D, and I know you can make all the Super D jokes you want, but yeah. Now, Topcon cameras were actually like very, very successful because of their optics. And in the United States, they often imported these cameras as the bestseller or bestseller. And I think when it came to like Australia and other countries, some of these cameras were actually like renamed as like the Honeymex. Actually, let me take that back. Honeymex was more of a distributor of various different camera companies from Europe and China and Japan. So you're able to find some of these cameras with the bestseller name on them or Honeymex name on them, and they can be Topcons. They're just like imported and distributed. But yeah, if you're in the United States, you probably find one with the name bestseller on them. That's just like an import of the Topcon cameras. Okay, up to this point, like, Topcon was very good at innovation, and like I said, they had amazing optics, and they were years ahead of Nikon, Pentax, Canon, and all the other camera companies, but they were just not very good at selling themselves, you know, because and here's the way I understood this. Like, even though Topcon had like the best optics at the time, the professionals preferred the Nikon cameras, and the masses preferred the Pentax, you know, because they were very good at marketing, and that's where Topcon basically failed. They failed to market themselves. Their cameras, they were very big and bulky. Even though I like them, like, I can see how like the average person would not like the look of a Topcon camera. You know, it's like it was very manly. I think it's a very, very manly camera. I mean, it's made to withstand bullets and stuff, but like, people would prefer something like the Spotmatic or like the Pentax cameras because they're just better looking. So they didn't sell very well at the release of one of their cameras. I forgot exactly which one, and eventually they just kind of stopped stopped trying to sell cameras. Like in, I think it was 1981, they just left the camera business for good. Like they just kind of quietly disappeared off the camera companies, you know? And they're still around. I mean, they're like the world leaders in like GPS and tracking and stuff like that, but they stopped making cameras in 81. So they had a very short lifespan from like 32 to like 81. If they had stayed, I'm pretty sure they would have wiped the floor with like Canon, Nikon, and all the other camera companies, because their optics are just like some of the best, which is one of the reasons I'm making this video, because like I really, really like these cameras. And I actually have one lens. I have the Topcon RE 58mm 1.4, which has a very, very interesting story. And I want to tell you that story because, like I said, nobody else here on YouTube makes those videos. The only videos I have found are in Japanese, and I know most of you don't know Japanese. So let me know how I did. Sorry if I got a few details a little bit mixed up, even though I think I did a pretty good job of them. But I really enjoy these kind of educational videos, especially like when it comes to like the history of vintage lenses or just vintage lenses in general. Yeah, I'll see you around.